Welcome to From Clinical to Entrepreneurial, OT Private Practice Journeys, an Ontario Society of Occupational Therapists podcast. In this series, we connect with occupational therapists, private practitioners, and business owners, and we hear about their inspiration, their stories, and their lessons learned. I'm Seema Sandwani, OSOT's Director of Strategic Partnerships and Practice. In this episode, my co-host Shari and I sit down with OT Rhona Feldt-Stein, who, from 1983 to 2024, owned and operated 3 rehab companies. Whether you're just starting your private practice or thinking about long-term growth and exit planning, this episode is filled with wisdom from an experienced OT entrepreneur. We hope you enjoy our conversation. Hello, Rhona, 2024 OSOT Honorary Life Membership Award recipient. Welcome. It's great to have you.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Good to be here.
Great. So we've got lots of questions for you today, lots of information that we want to get because we know you've got a wealth of experience and knowledge to impart. Before we dive in, we would love to know a little bit about you. So where did you do your OT degree? How long have you been practicing? Can you share a little bit about you?
Sure. I graduated from Western University. We were the first class to go through all 4 years, and it was very interesting. We were known as the guinea pigs.
Now, we do certainly want to dive into the entrepreneurship and the business owner piece. Just before we do that, can you tell us just very briefly what area of practice you went into, let's say right out of school? I'm assuming you weren't a business owner day one. Correct me if I'm wrong, but what was your first path like?
Well, I graduated close to 50 years ago. So at that time, when you graduated, you either worked in a hospital or you worked in a rehab center or you worked for home care. There was no private practice. So I had an internship at Sick Kids, and pediatrics was always my choice of area of work. And from there, I went up to what is now South Lake Hospital. I could not find any work in pediatrics. So neurology was my second choice. So I went up for an interview for a position as an OT in their adult neuro team. And when I walked in, I saw a plaque that said Children's Ward. And during my interview, I talked them up about pediatrics and, you know, what was going on with the pediatric ward. And lo and behold, they hired me to start a pediatric rehab program as a new grad. And I worked part-time and adult neuro, and the other half was spent working on the children's board and starting an outpatient program as well. So I always loved neuro.
So you've been a trailblazer since day one, since the interview.
I guess so.
Yeah. Oh, that's wonderful. So fast forward and tell us, how long have you been a business owner? How did you get into that? The motivation? Let's dive into all that good stuff.
Sure. So while I was at South Lake, the pediatric program grew and grew. And I just couldn't handle all the inpatient and the outpatient in a really quick manner because people wanted to be seen right away, especially if they had been discharged, if their child had been discharged from the inpatient and they wanted outpatient. And the waiting list was so long that a parent said to me, "I'll pay you to see my child." And that sort of started the ball rolling. I got permission from the administration to say that I had not solicited. This parent came up to me. They're on the waiting list. And, you know, would it be a conflict of interest for me to see them, you know, privately and so on? And that's how it started. And I started seeing them in the basement of our home. And then word of mouth I absolutely did not solicit any business through what kind of advertising was available. You're talking, almost 37 years ago.
Right.
And and so that's how the private practice started. It was parent driven.
I feel like it's interesting because I started accidentally too, somewhat intentionally, but I'm here accidentally as well. It's kind of interesting how so many therapists sort of find themselves moving in that direction totally unintentionally.
Yeah.
Did you ever think, because I know private practice wasn't really a thing back from the 37 years ago you were talking about, did you ever think at some point, oh, I'd like to be in business or an entrepreneur? Or did you just sort of follow your caseload and things happened?
Exactly. Followed my caseload and things happened. I mean, there was no private practices really, and certainly there was a few in Toronto. Interaction was available for adults that had neurological, problems. There are a few people, popping up with private practice. I think also VHA, which was known by a different name,
Yeah,
started real, really moving the ball forward for private practice, and it became such a big company, and a lot of people didn't want that size of a company.
yeah.
They wanted to keep it small and personal. And so that was my motivation in keeping it small and personal. And also, I wanted to ensure that there was a range of services. So it was never my goal just to have OT as part of the practice, but to
Okay.
have it multi professional. So physio and speech therapy.
So how did that develop over the years? So, because I know, which we'll talk about today, you've had some recent big changes, but to get there, I know you had to do some building and scaling and developing. So what did your practice end up looking like? Maybe say 2 years ago. Oh, I know that was in the height of, I guess, right after COVID, but what did your practice look like then? And then how did that progress?
Sure. So it was just myself, seeing people on a Saturday in the
Okay.
basement of my home. And then I got really busy, so I hired another therapist,
Okay.
um, who would come in and work in my home. And then it just became overwhelming because I had young children and it
Right.
just wasn't suitable. So the other therapists started going into people's homes.
Okay.
And it then evolved into, well, it wasn't practical because they couldn't take the equipment that was needed,
Right.
specifically for pediatrics, and we were doing sensory integration. Um, so what we needed to do was look for a space that was common and in the community and not in my home anymore.
Yeah.
So that happened probably about maybe 3 years after I started the private practice. And we were moving to Richmond Hill. And I wanted something that was going to be close to my home since I had young children and was feasible and at the same time close to public transportation for those parents that didn't have their own car and so on. So there was a lot of thinking as
Yeah.
to where I was going to go, but what it would look like.
Yeah, which is really interesting because I found that for myself too. Like circumstances have always just dictated where we ended up and when we expanded and when we started a new place. So I know this is going back a little bit, but did you have sort of a specific budget that was based on, for a new therapist who's thinking at this stage that you and I are talking about, where they're like, oh, I've got to find space.
Mm.
What are your
And it's just me and one other
recommendations?
person, right?
Right,
Yeah.
because
Right.
yeah, like how did you plan the financial side of that?
Well, I didn't even know about a business plan.
Yeah.
Right.
And there were so few private practices. And I was the first pediatric multidisciplinary private practice in York Region.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I really didn't have anybody that I could really go to. I certainly went to Interaction and the owners of Interaction, and spoke with them about how they started their practice. Um, there was another pediatric physiotherapist in Toronto who was more or less starting her therapy practice around the same time, again, working out of her house and then looking sort of to move out. And so I spoke with them, but I I didn't know what a business plan was. I had
Yeah,
absolutely no business acumen at all.
I hear you.
Um, but I went to the bank and I opened up an account
Yeah.
in the business name. So I had to find a business name, register it, and so on. Went to the bank, said, I need startup money. And this is what I'm doing. I told them, I was working with special needs children, and there wasn't anything like that. And I was, more or less across the street from them. So they were my bank choice, and
Yeah.
yada, 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 schmoozed a little bit, maybe more than a little bit, tried to pull on heartstrings about
The people you're
working with.
Your
serving, the kids
population.
you're
Yeah.
helping. Yes.
Exactly,
Yes.
exactly. And I was able to negotiate an unsecured loan and line of credit.
Interesting. So you were, which I think is fascinating because I've always, through my practice, I've always been like, this is how much we make. So all of our operational costs have to be as a percentage of the income that we make, which has really, in some ways, paced things because you can't you can't grow if you don't have the money. And I find this such a great approach. And I know it's something I've never explored. And I love that you just got the money and you made it happen and then you built it.
Yes, yes. I
Was
mean,
that terrifying?
I'm thinking of all of the emotions, the kids at home, this new space with, oh my gosh, right? I am thinking of the myriad of emotions.
Like you jumped. That's
absolutely.
amazing.
Jumped.
Well, and I had asked my husband, who's a lawyer,
Yeah.
you know, would you come to the bank with me? He said, no. He said, you do this on your own.
You
I know
do
you
it.
can do this. And I did.
Wow. That's awesome. Okay. So you found your space, you started to build, and your goal was to make something multidisciplinary.
Yes. But
And
I
at the
have to
time you were just OT?
just
Just you and
OT,
your other, okay.
just OT. I was fortunate enough that the space that I found was part of a plaza, a big plaza, but it was around the back and north end of the plaza. So it wasn't visual inside the plaza.
Right.
So it wasn't the kind of, it was a storefront office, but because I wasn't part of the open area where people would come and go to multiple stores, I you negotiate the fact that it was dead space in the
Mm.
plaza. And the owner of the plaza, when he heard what I wanted to do and why I wanted to do it, was so heartstruck
Uh-huh.
that he gave me the space at $500 a month.
That's awesome. How many square feet was the space?
It was about 900
That's
square feet.
fabulous. So you really like you had your vision of where you wanted to take it, and then you sort of you got all the infrastructure and the funding in place, you set it up, and then you built it. That was sort of the way your approach took you.
Yes.
Okay, so
And
walk us through that point to growing, scaling. Um, what consultants did you start to use? What other disciplines did you start to add? How did you start to build that further?
So we built it up mainly with OTs because that's, what I could offer at the time, and that's what parents wanted
Yeah.
was OT.
Right.
And you're
There's,
talking the beginning of autism.
yeah.
Autism wasn't a thing at that time. So we worked a lot with kids who had um, some head injuries, um, because Blue Review was looking for places to send kids after they were
Gotcha.
discharged from there.
Mhm.
And the waiting list for publicly funded therapy was really becoming very tight. They didn't want to wait. Their child had been in a car accident. They didn't want to wait. And so they were really pushing, like we need to be seen now. So the OT and the other kinds of kids that we saw were kids with learning disabilities, ADD, ADHD, sensory-based issues, and so on, some handwriting, and
Yeah.
that was the bulk of our practice. But um, as it grew and there were more complicated cases coming forward, I knew I needed a physio.
Right.
So I hired a physio and then moved on to hiring speech. And we also took in a tutor who
Oh,
had been a special needs
Mm.
teacher and retired. And so Sharon came in and she rented space from us. And
okay. So
it just,
were all these other professionals under your umbrella, or did they sublet space from you and share client base?
yeah. So Sharon, the tutor, sublet space from us, but all the other people were subcontractors of York
Okay.
Pediatric Therapy.
Okay.
Okay. And then was most of your, because I know that this was, pre-social media and so on. So was most of your marketing really based on the networks and relationships you built with sort of the other organizations?
Yes. And a lot of knocking on doors with doctors, setting up meetings, setting up meetings with different places like Kinark and
Yeah.
psychologists and I really think that that knock on the door with a cup of coffee and a couple of cookies is
Yeah.
still the way to go.
And is that an approach? Because I could see why when the information that you sent and so on right away, I was thinking your marketing must be very relationship based. I was wondering if it's still been that way even until the past couple of years. Have you done it, and have you expanded into sort of online social media, or was it really very relationship based still now?
Um, for me, it was a combination of social media and that face to face.
Okay.
Um, and even though we were doing social media, for me, I love the face to face marketing
Mm.
because there's so much emotion you can put into that
Yeah.
Yeah.
that you can't on social media. It just doesn't come across the same. And I think when you make that personal connection and there's real eye contact, it comes across as so much more genuine. They have the ability to answer questions and get their answers right away. You can't do that on social media. And we're working with children's lives
Yeah.
Yeah.
here and you're working with their parent. So if you're going to go to a psychologist or you're going to go to a pediatrician and you can show them your passion, that's your selling point.
So for you, your target market tended to be the referral sources.
Yes.
Okay, that's fantastic.
Yes.
It can be a challenge. How did you find, I know we've got so many things to talk about, so I'm going to
That's
make
okay.
this a
Yeah.
really quick question.
No worries.
Because doctors' offices, as you know, Rona, are like, they're pretty hard to sort of get your foot in the door with a doctor's office. So, what were your approaches to getting them to sort of recognize you and allow you to come in and communicate with them? How did you do that?
It was persistent.
Okay.
I was
Didn't take no for an answer. I don't know. Sorry, did that just
My husband and children will tell you it's not a character trait that they love. But,
There's something to that though, right? There's something to, well, I'm just not going to take no for an answer.
well, I would just say to the secretaries, I just want 15 minutes of their time.
Okay.
15 minutes, and I will stick to the 15 minutes. But I really think that, there's possibility of a very strong relationship. There isn't at that point, there wasn't, another place for them really to go.
Right.
So I worked on the aspect of, we're the only game in town.
Yeah.
And through the years, certainly there's been a plethora of pediatric private practices that have come up. So if I would go in with coffee, it was for the secretary or the receptionist and the doctor. I wouldn't isolate that front person
Yeah.
at all because they're the ones that are really going to support you.
So
Yeah.
then here's the other really concrete question. Did you telephone the secretary to have the conversation and ask for the audience, or would you go in person to each individual physician's
I would
office?
always call ahead. I
Okay.
wanted them to know that I respected their time
Right.
and
Not
I
just showing up.
respected their practice. Yes.
Yeah.
So you would telephone, you would ask for a meeting with the physicians all at once, like a lunch meeting, 15-minute
I would
info
ex-
session?
I would explain who I am. I'd say I'm Rhona Feldt-Stein. I own
Yeah.
York Pediatric Therapy. I really would love the opportunity to speak to the doctor about what we do, and I would explain exactly what we do,
Yeah.
and express that I would love to be able to form a working relationship to support their clients.
And I
Right.
think there has to be, it's just almost simple but brilliant. It's the what's in it for the physician. I'm coming to tell you that I have something that I can help your patients with. And
Right.
it's an approach that pharmaceutical representatives use. I mean, other people have
Yeah.
used this approach too. I think this is lovely to hear because we want OTs to know that they can do it too, right? There's no
Yeah.
reason not to.
I think it's
But
really interesting. Yeah.
yeah, it's
Thank
so
you for
interesting and
that
different from Shara, your
information.
experience, which I love that I can see you're saying, oh, this is so different than the way. Yeah.
And
Well,
it's old
it
school, but it
is.
still
It's
works.
old school. Yeah, no, I think
Yeah.
there's
But it works.
yeah, there's a lot of strategy that goes into it, but I think that is that persistence and following up and bringing the flowers and bringing the cookies
And
and being nice even years down the road.
yeah,
So I
genuinely
think that's
kind.
interesting. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Sorry, so we have so many things to talk about.
We
So
do
Seema, I'm going to shut my mouth for a
no,
second.
no, you're great, Shari. The only thing I was going to do to kind of wrap that up with a bow is to say, I think folks are also inundated with social media. And hopefully
Yeah.
that's not a terrible taboo thing to say. I think it's a nice break. Honestly, we're inundated with that. So I think it's a nice shift maybe, or
So
shift back, or,
yeah.
So Rhona, you talked a little bit about having subcontractors. So if we look at the business when is at its prime, we just want to know a little bit from you around the structure. Have you incorporated? Do you have employees? Is it still subcontractors? Can you tell us a little bit about the structure?
Sure. So the way that I structured it was I couldn't afford to have full-time employees.
Yeah,
Oh yeah, that's a thing. Oh
whole
my
thing.
gosh,
I
does that
just,
ever take
when
a
I was
lot of
starting out,
math?
I
Yeah.
couldn't afford them.
Yeah.
And this way, it also gave the subcontractors more leeway. So if they wanted to take holidays, they could do it when they wanted, not when I was telling them that they could do it, and so on. So it worked out that way. And I made their hourly wage a little higher because I wasn't supplying any benefits or
Yeah.
things like that. And the fact that therapists that were working in treatment centers and in hospitals were getting a slightly lower rate, but they were also getting benefits, which is an added cost. So
Yeah.
I really, because there really was no pay structure guideline from
Mhm.
OSOT at that point, because nobody was really doing private practice. So I took into the fact what was potential hourly rate that an employee would get with benefits and sort of came to
Try to match that.
a base, uh, a base hourly rate based on experience,
Okay.
and would then, revise it with cost of living as years went on.
So
Um,
did you have sort of a preset goal, like percentage of profit, percentage that you would pay for operating costs, percentage to the therapist, or how did you break that down?
I, to be honest with you, I never really even thought about it like that
Okay.
because I had nobody else to go on.
Yeah.
Um, and to say, well, I did speak to a couple people and they
Yeah.
said, well, we only provide, 55% of the
Yeah.
hourly rate, or whatever. And I was perhaps more generous,
What was your
than most.
percentage, if you're comfortable
So
saying?
they were getting easily 65%.
Okay, and you had operating costs
And I had
and
operating
everything else
costs.
embedded. And were you carrying your own caseload at this time, or were you
Yes.
full-time
Well,
clinic management?
no, I
Okay.
wasn't full time. As the business started out, I needed a regular salary. So I
Yeah.
was working as a consultant with the Board of Education
Oh,
and then
wow.
would do this after school into the evenings and on Saturday.
Oh, okay. That was a
Why do we
full-time
do
job?
these things to
I
ourselves,
did
Rhoda?
like almost two full-time jobs, but it was what I needed to do to keep
Yeah.
the clinic going. And then I hired, I think it was year 10 or so,
Wow.
I maybe a little earlier, I hired a part-time, um, receptionist.
Right.
So she would answer the calls and I taught her how to do the intakes and so on. And then it eventually grew that she was a full-time employee.
Okay. So I know that there's sort of a really big topic that we do want to make sure that we discuss today, and I just want to make sure we have a good amount of time to do that. So I'm going to sort of launch into
That's
this because you grew your practice. I'm guessing, Rona, from what you're telling us, that you had it sort of stable. You knew you had it in a good position where you wanted to, and then you started to think about exit plan.
Yes.
How did that evolve, and what are your thoughts on that whole experience? Because it is a thing.
huge.
Yeah. I reached a point where my knees were no good anymore because getting down on the floor, standing up 100 times a day,
Yeah,
hooking up, you know, equipment in the ceiling and
yeah,
putting kids in that and doing a lot of proprio kinds of things. um my body was suffering
yeah.
uh because of that, and so I needed to pare down my caseload, and I needed to spend more time in marketing.
Okay.
And so my own caseload I was decreasing, and I had amazing staff that I knew I could rely on for their skills. I would perhaps do more assessment and then pass on the clients to other therapists, uh,
Okay. And how
because it was,
big, sorry, how big was your team at this point when you were making these decisions and shifts?
well, I had diversified the clinic. So we had contracts with private schools
Okay.
in York Region, in Peel, in Toronto, Mississauga.
Okay.
Um, so we had therapists going into private schools. So we had speech and OT, and as needed, our physio would go into schools.
Okay.
So that was like part of the practice as well as the clinic.
Right.
And then I personally was doing medical legal work.
Okay. Okay.
So the clinic was quite diversified at
Yeah.
that point. and everybody was part-time.
Okay. Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay.
We have a lot of
So,
that structure too with our
right.
psychotherapists. Yeah.
So there were at one time 18 bodies.
Okay. Okay. So a good amount of support as you made that
And Rhona,
transition.
18 bodies plus a full-time receptionist, any other non-clinical team members?
A tutor that was renting
Right,
space
right. 'Cause you mentioned that.
yeah.
And did you do all your own marketing, or did you have someone doing some of the social media support and so on?
No, I started, and certainly because I'm a relic, I don't know all the things about.
I don't either.
Right.
So then I started giving that to one of our younger therapists,
Yeah.
because they
Amazing.
were
Okay.
more.
Makes sense.
Okay.
And I would pay her. I negotiated with her that I would pay her so much money for so much time every month.
Okay.
Okay, fabulous. Okay, sorry, that was a bit of a digression there, just so I
It's
can
a
get an
good tangent, a helpful
understanding of.
tangent. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so you started shifting some work away, you had things stable, you knew things had to change.
Change. And my parents were older and basically the only sibling in town. So I was seeing that I was needing a lot of time to take care of my parents.
Yep.
And, medical appointments for them and so on. And so I had to look at it and say, okay, like you're doing all of this time and taking it away from the clinic and so on. How much longer do you think you're going to be able to do this at the same rate that you've been doing right along? And I just knew that I couldn't do it.
Okay.
So I had spoken to a couple of people who had their own adult private clinics, because at that point, um, I was I guess, Tima Stein, who's a pediatric physiotherapist, and I were the oldest therapists in private practice. And Tima and I talked about, that and what would happen. And I spoke to a few other therapists in Toronto that had their own pediatric clinics that started a little after me, and said, what's your plan? What do you think, when do you think you want to stop, kind of thing? And it sort of solidified in my mind that I was more or less going on the right track as far
Right.
as thinking that I needed to cut back and so
Right.
on. And I started speaking, as I said, to people who had adult practices about, how they went about finding a buyer and so on.
Right.
But what I did find is that most of those people that I spoke to were doing insurance work. So working with
Mhm.
adults who had been in MVAs, and it was all adult based. I did make appointments with large groups of people, um, but what I found was that they wanted to come in and make it an MVA clinic and did not understand that you treat children entirely different than you treat an adult,
Mm.
and
So can I?
especially a child who had a motor vehicle accident with a traumatic head injury.
For
Mm.
sure. Yeah.
Because children grow into their injuries as they get
Mm.
older and the brain develops, they grow into it.
That's a good way of saying it. Yeah.
Mm.
May I ask, just more on the practical side, right? Say you've got someone who's at that point thinking, I think I want to sell, and that whole process of getting started and what are you worth and how do you have the conversations? So what did you do? Did you just sort of message, say, hi, I'm a clinician, I'm thinking of selling my practice. Can I talk to someone there? And that set you up with a meeting? Is that how it
Yes,
went?
that's
And did
exactly how
you?
it went.
Okay. And
Hmm.
did you start by sort of divulging information, or you just said, this is my practice, like here's my website, here's my information, let me know if you want to talk?
I did that. I
Okay.
would come in with material
Yeah.
because again, social media, was
Wouldn't
not as
represent your entire brand. You need it to
Right.
be
There's
yeah,
so
it was
many pieces. Yeah.
yeah. So I would go in with written information or I would send it ahead of time to
Yeah.
them and
Yeah.
set up a meeting. So I was very conscious of being professional, not wasting their time and not
Yeah.
wasting my time.
Yeah,
For sure.
sure.
It's a huge process.
Yeah.
So that's the way I went about it, but I was so disheartened by their approach. And I said, listen, the MVA part of my practice is very small in comparison to the rest.
Yeah.
Like these, the clinic works with kids that don't have all of these issues. They're coming in because they've got attention and learning disabilities
Right.
and whatever. And I said, it's not my intention that I want to turn it into an MVA factory. That is not it.
Yeah.
And just to
And
pause and clarify for 1 second, Rhona, when you comment that you were disheartened by their approach, you mean more as a general disheartened by kind of like regardless of who you were connecting with, everyone seemed to have that outlook. They weren't treating your clinic in a way that you kind of thought it would carry on, right? Like
Like
a
as a
general
absolutely.
unique,
yeah.
as a unique
Yeah.
clinic.
As a unique,
Yes,
not MVA heavily focused, but these are children with different needs. So I just wanted to add that
yes,
clarification. As a general, that's
yes,
what you kind of found, right? Okay,
yes,
thank you.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So then, what I did was I spoke to a couple of therapists who had been working with me for over 25 years.
So these were
And
your own
yeah,
therapists, part of your group, and you
yes,
divulged to them that you were thinking about doing this.
yes.
Telling, okay.
And one of my therapists, her husband's a doctor, and he went back to school, did an MBA, and was interested in perhaps starting a company that would own some private pediatric clinics.
Hmm.
Okay.
And so we met. He had a potential investor, and we met several times, and we we're going to move forward. But the investor happened to be a chiropractor and thought that he could run a children's clinic the way you do a physio adult clinic.
Mm.
I've heard that story before. Yeah. Mental health and pediatrics do not match a physio clinic approach. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So, I said we need specific equipment and that has to be open in your gym. And we're working with kids on the spectrum. How are your other adult clients coming in for knees and shoulders and so on going to react
Right.
when a child has a fit and is screaming and crying and is in the middle of your gym and doesn't want to leave? So I really tried to put a light on, practically what this could look like.
Mm.
And he was still interested and thought perhaps, we could try out one clinic. So he was willing to renovate one of his clinics. He had several, to try it out and see how it might work. And COVID happened
Ah,
Oh, wow. Mm.
and shut everything down.
yeah.
Right.
And I there's no way that I can describe how COVID affected our business. The schools were closed for a year and a half. The
Yeah.
clinic was closed. We couldn't see people. We couldn't do home visits. I mean, the business literally shut down
Shut down. Mm.
for a period. Because what could we do?
No,
Mhm.
I know you're so challenged in those
And the thing
circumstances.
is,
Yeah.
for some of the kids, we could do virtual with a 3-year-old autistic child.
No. Well, and I think actually that's interesting because our caseload also is not highly MVA. We have a little bit, but it's more a smattering. And I did notice that a lot of after COVID or even during COVID, a lot more of the MVA clients or the companies doing that just sort of ticked along. They continued okay. Whereas a lot of the people like us, and sounds like you, who had a higher private practice percentage of our client base, they weren't coming in. Like, it was a really bigger shock. And actually, you're making me think that I'd never put those two pieces together until you just said that to me, that the client base really dictated how we power through during COVID, because we're private practice too. Yeah, interesting.
Yeah.
I'm just going to fill in a couple little gaps for the people listening. So, when you are selling or considering selling a business, there are agents that can help you, and they have training sort of in the real estate world. So you can find one of those, interviewing them, and so on, and they will shop your business, market it, and they'll be sort of the intermediary. But what you did, Rhona, is you did it sort of independently, which I think you've done the whole way through. You were just like sort of wed for it, and you made the leap. So you did that yourself. So just so those people listening know. I also have a question about, in those first negotiations where you were getting close to selling, how did you set your price? What did you do to set your price?
It it was very difficult because of the financial hit that we had during COVID, and
Right.
then
Right.
this is post-COVID. So we were
Okay.
in a recovery mode. We did have quite a number of people on a wait list.
Yeah.
So I put the value of the wait list and potential business that could come off that wait list into part of the negotiations.
Okay. Yeah, you got it right in that circumstance, because you know the business was going to pick up when people could come back. So
Right.
was it EBITDA calculation that
I
you did,
used an
or
EBITDA. I did use that, but I also did speak to some agents, real estate agents, um, to sort of say, I mean, to say I never used an agent is wrong. I did
okay.
use an agent. There were two fellows, and they never could come up, and maybe it was the timing because around COVID and so
Right.
on, and people were frantically trying to make up, and not sell, buy
Yeah.
stuff. But they could never come up with the right match.
Yeah. It's a hard match to find. It's
It
hard
is
to
a hard
find.
match. It's a
And
very hard match. And
yeah,
so the way that this person showed up, as I mentioned before, is that he had or has a very needy special needs child of his own. And there there was a common person that we both knew, and he had voiced at some point to this person he would be interested in buying a clinic and ensuring that it would run far better than the kinds of services his own child had received.
interesting. Okay.
So a personal
And
motivation, a bit of a
Yeah.
yeah,
personal, yeah.
yeah. So that's sort of how we met. We talked about, the loss of business, but the potential for it recouping itself. And there were times, I'm gonna be very honest, there were times that the business, during holidays and kids get sick during
Yeah.
the winters a lot, and there's cancellations and there's March breaks and summers and so on, where, our cash flow was low, and I
Yeah.
personally invested my own money back into the clinic to keep it going.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I certainly wanted to ensure that I got that investment
Yeah.
back
Yeah.
Yeah.
personally. That
Now,
that was really important to me.
now, Rona, it's not like I can ask a question that's going to sum up your, is it 40-year career?
Almost 50.
Almost 50-year career. But to sort of take us out, to close us out, um, I want to end on a positive, really, and ask you, tell us what you feel is the best thing about having your own clinic, the best thing about being a business owner. Leave us with that.
Um, when I was working as a consultant for a Board of Education, everything I did or wanted to do had to be scrutinized by somebody up above
Mm.
for the smallest thing. And it drove me crazy
Yeah.
because I could see the potential of what the change could do in as far as efficiency and in managing caseload, or the fact that we were still writing our notes by hand and somebody who retired walked off with a board top and thinking, are you kidding me? He's got an office he can go to. We're going between schools. And so to me, that drove me crazy. So being my own boss, I could do whatever I wanted within reason.
Of course. Yeah.
And I was a person that always thought outside the box. And because of that, there were times when people said, oh, that's not practical. And I was so frustrated by saying, but you haven't tried it yet.
Yeah.
And so being my own boss, I could do those things out of the box. I could look at different pieces of equipment and buy it when I want it, not because it had to go through 4 and 5 people.
Right.
I wanted to create a vision that supported, was aligned with the vision of parents, and allowed me to really make a positive difference in the lives of these kids. And I knew I couldn't do it if I stayed in a big organization.
I can't think of a more beautiful way to end this podcast. Rhona, it has been such a pleasure getting to know you and hearing your story. And thank you so much for your time. Lots to unpack from that conversation. Tune in next week when we interview Laura DeRoger, who was inspired to start her private practice from a personal place. Subscribe so you don't miss an episode and share this series with your colleagues. We'll see you next time.